a couple more weeks in the Charis series, and then we're going to do a 2-week Christmas series. And then we'll jump back into John's Gospel in January. For those of you who may not have been here, the Charis series has been an ongoing series about grace. The word charis means God's grace in the New Testament. And so we have spent a lot of time talking about grace. We spent a lot of time in the Old Testament and have kind of transitioned through every era of the Old Testament, seeing how in a part of the Bible that we don't often find a lot of grace, that there is actually this thread of grace throughout the entire Old Testament. And so we have caught just a glimpse of the many stories in the Old Testament that put God's grace on display. We're going to transition these last couple of weeks into the New Testament and see how this kind of plays out in the New Testament. So I do want to encourage you to go back if you missed any of the weeks and watch them or listen to them. Encourage other people that you know that may be struggling in some of these areas to go and to spend some time in the Charis series. I do think it is a potentially life-changing series if we can take what God has been teaching us in this series and apply it into our everyday lives. Being a pastor, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. Some advantages there along the way, some disadvantages along the way. One of the disadvantages that I have found is when people find out that you are a pastor, how they respond to that. And people respond all different ways, particularly a guy like me. I still work a full-time, a regular job, whatever that means, and lead city church on the weekends and then here and there through the week as I have time. And so when someone finds out in conversation that I'm a pastor, they respond in a few different ways. One of the most common ways that people respond when they find out you're a pastor is they suddenly clean up their language. Okay, maybe things they would have said they wouldn't say, or if they have said something, they'll apologize for what they have said, and that always puts me in like an awkward situation. I'm always like, well, I'm not the one you should be worried about how you talk in front of. There's someone actually a little higher than me that we should be more concerned about how we talk and behave. So that's a common one. I've had people who are smoking suddenly feel out the urge to put out their cigarette when they find out I'm a pastor. And again, doesn't bother me if you smoke or don't smoke, and there's no reason to hide a lit cigarette for sure. You can usually see the little trail of smoke coming up. One of the common ones, I'm not going to call any names here, one of the common ones is, should I have some type of alcoholic beverage in front of the pastor or not? I know that at least one, if not a couple of occasions, even here at City Church, when Ashley and I were going to have dinner or something with someone, that there was a conversation prior to the dinner on whether they should order a beer or not order a beer, or a glass of wine or not a glass of wine, or some type of alcoholic beverage. If you've been around me, you know that I don't care if you have a beer. And if it'll help ease your mind, I'll order one so that you'll feel okay ordering one as well. But it's just funny, like those type of conversations that we have sometimes, and that's one of the disadvantages of being a pastor, is people suddenly feel like they need to somehow change their behavior or their language or something because they're suddenly around a pastor. How they talk, how they act, the stories they tell suddenly need to change. One thing I find very interesting about the life of Jesus is that people that were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And Jesus liked people who were nothing like him. Do you get that? People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And Jesus liked people who were nothing like him. He hung out with people who were nothing like him. Jesus was God in the flesh. He was holy in every way. Jesus never sinned. He never had a wrong thought. He never performed a wrong action. He never in any way behaved in a way that would point people away from God. He always made the right decision. He was absolutely holy in everything he did. And yet, the people he hung out with were very unholy people, were very unrighteous people. They were nothing like Jesus. We've all heard the little cliche that we are known by the company that we keep. What does that say about Jesus? If we are known by the type of people we hang out with, the company that we keep, what does that say about Jesus? Jesus hung out with some hoodlums. As a matter of fact, he opted out of hanging with the religious people of his day. He opted out of hanging out with the religious elite. And instead, he hung out with notorious sinners. Even his own followers were people of questionable reputations. Even his own disciples were people of questionable reputations. So when Jesus was picked to pick a team, you ever been in that context? All right, we're going to have team captains. We're going to go old schoolyard here. We're going to pick teams. So if I'm a captain selected to pick a team against another captain to pick a team, and the group, and we're gonna do something athletic, okay? That's usually why you pick teams. You're going to do some type of sporting event. And some of you were the athletic types that got chosen in the top half of the selection process. Some of you were less than athletic, and you got chosen in the bottom half of the selection process. Some of you just opted out of the kickball altogether because you knew you were probably not going to be chosen. It doesn't matter where you're at in that mix. The person picking the team, it seems like it would make sense for him to pick people that would help them win the game, right? Like, why else would you be playing? If you're involved, I'm a competitive person, so like for me, if we're doing some type of athletic event, like I don't want to do it just for the exercise. That's lame. Like, I want to win. I want to compete. I want to be on the winning side. Like, I want the ribbon. I want the trophy. I don't want just the participant trophy. I want the winning trophy because I'm competitive. Not everybody's wired that way, but if I'm picking teams, I want to pick the kid that'll help me win the game, to win the competition. I mean, how lame would it be if you're the team captain and you have the opportunity to pick the kids that can help you win in kickball, and you're like, I'm going to take that kid. You know, the one I just saw eating paint off the walls in the classroom, like, that walked into the doorway on his way out of here, like, I'll take him. Like, what kind of captain picks that? Like, what captain picks the kid that on the way out to the kickball field falls and gets hurt on his own? Like, you don't pick that kid, right? You don't pick the kid that just pulled earwax out of his ear and is nibbling on it during the selection process. You pick the athletic kids if you want to win. And so when Jesus selects his followers, it seems like he would pick the religious kids, the people who had it all put together, the people that were abiding by the 10 Commandments. It seems like that the team that Jesus selected would reflect his holiness. Instead, what we find in the New Testament is this island of misfit toys that Jesus picks. Let me illustrate this for you. This is a famous painting by Da Vinci of the Last Supper. So this is the famous Last Supper painting. And so obviously you look at this and this is kind of the image that we have of the Last Supper. Now, what Jesus perhaps looked like. When you have a mental picture of Jesus and his followers, you might have something similar to this. So this is Leonardo da Vinci's depiction of the Last Supper. Let me put up Peter Howson's depiction of the Last Supper. I love this rendition of the Last Supper as well. Now leave this up for a little bit so we can see it. Howson took a different approach than Da Vinci when he was giving a portrayal of the Last Supper. I mean, if I saw this and didn't know what it was, I would think, like, what, an Iron Maiden album, or is something besides a picture of the Last Supper. I mean, one of the disciples is wearing a wife beater, right? One is smoking a cigar, if you really got in close to it, you would see a bunch of scars, a bunch of evidence of uncivilized behavior and uncivilized lifestyle. What we have discovered about grace in this series is that grace pursues the unrighteous. Grace aggressively pursues the unrighteous, and grace, on the other hand, threatens the righteous. Grace threatens the righteous. Grace intimidates the righteous because we can't control it. The primary conflict that Jesus had in his day was with graceless religion. That's the primary conflict he had. It's eventually, we could argue, what nailed him to a tree. Was his conflict with graceless religion. And what the Jesus story tells us, what the story of redemption says, is that God aggressively pursues people who pull away from Him through their sin, and people who have been pushed away by the self-righteous. That God aggressively pursues people who willingly pull away from Him by their sin, and God aggressively pursues people who have been pushed away by those who claim to be righteous. The stories that we have looked at throughout the Old Testament, I've told you that many of them ended up in the genealogy of the gospel writer Matthew. That when Matthew sat down to pen the story of Jesus, that he was writing primarily to a Jewish audience in his gospel. And so to prove the messiahship of Jesus, he traced the bloodline of Jesus through kind of the common figureheads of the Old Testament that were Jewish. The Abraham, Isaac, the Jacob, through David. He traced the bloodline through the people that we would expect to see in the story of Jesus. But when we read the genealogy of Matthew, and we're not going to do it this morning, but when we read the genealogy of Matthew, what we have said, based on the stories we have looked at in the Old Testament, is that the genealogy of Matthew really reads almost like a late-night Cinemax series, right? There's like no editing of it. Matthew almost goes out of his way to highlight the bad characters. That Matthew brings up the stories that we wish that he would ignore. That Matthew highlights the characters in the Jesus bloodline that most people would sweep under the rug. That even when Matthew brings up David, he reminds us of the most controversial story of David. When he says David, and by the way, David was married to the wife of Uriah, like he just puts it out there on the table. The Tamars and the Rahabs and the Bathshebas, that Matthew highlights the bad instead of ignoring it. And you know why he does that? Because the flaws are the point. That's the point of the Jesus story. That's the point of the gospel. The flaws in the story, the sin in the story, the bad characters in the story, that's the reason for the story. The flaws are the main point. And the exact same thing is true of Jesus' closest followers, his disciples. Luke chapter 6, verse 12, Luke tells us the disciples that Jesus selected. Here's his account. In these days, Jesus, he went out to the mountain to pray. And all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12. So there's this group of followers. Jesus, so there's the kind of pool of followers that Jesus is going to select 12, okay? So this is the old schoolyard. I'm going to take him, I'm going to take him, I'm going to take him from this giant group of followers. And he chose from them 12 whom he named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now, when we just read this in the text, it appears like it's just a list of names. But the stories behind these names point to the grace that is underneath. Point to the soil of grace from which these guys arise. Let me tell you about just a few of them. Simon Peter. We kind of dove into his life when we went through the Exile series together and preached through the book of 1 Peter. And if you know the story of Peter, you know he's very abrasive, very impulsive. He overreacts to everything. I've been accused of being an overreactor. Is this true, babe? You have an opportunity right now to speak the truth. There's a chance I'm an overreactor? That's stupid! I'm just kidding. See what I did there? An overreactor. I admit one of my few, but many, flaws is overreacting. And usually over something that is pretty meaningless in life. Sometimes very meaningful, and so it deserves a reaction of some sort. But I'll admit that there are times that something that really doesn't mean a lot in kind of the overarching big picture of life, I'll have a tendency to kind of overreact to it for just a few minutes. And then I'll kind of breathe and say, well, it's really not that big of a deal. It happened this week. I'm not going to name the incident, but my wife responded by saying, you overreact. Why are you overreacting? Because I'm a lot like Peter. Blame it on him. I'm just kidding. Peter was an overreactor in so many ways. He was overzealous, wasn't he? He had a quick tongue and a quicker temper. I mean, Peter is the guy, get this, that regularly rebukes Jesus. He rebukes the Son of God. Like he believes Jesus is the Messiah. He believes he's the Son of God. And yet, he believes that Jesus needs correcting on occasion and has no problem correcting him. Jesus rebukes, I love this one incident. Jesus is talking about dying on the cross and what's going to happen. I'm going to go, I'm going to be killed, that I'm going to be raised back to life. And Peter calls Jesus to the side and says, Jesus, stop talking so much about dying. Like, it's not good for the morale of your followers when you're talking so much about dying. Do we know the reason Jesus came to the earth? He came to do what? To die. And so when Jesus says, I'm going to go and be crucified, the religious are not going to like me, I'm going to be hated and despised, they're going to kill me, but guess what? Don't worry, after 3 days, I'm going to be raised back to life. Peter's overreaction, his overzealousness in the moment is to pull Jesus to the side. Like, look, Jesus, like, I know you can turn water into wine. And I saw you like walk on the ocean during the stormy season. I know you fed all these people with just a handful of fish and bread. But enough of the dying talk. Like, do you understand what this is doing for the morale of your followers? How did Jesus respond? Jesus responds and he says to Peter, get behind me. Not Peter, not Simon, your old name. Get behind me, Satan. Like, if you get called Satan by Jesus, you've definitely overstepped your bounds. What Jesus was saying to Peter is, what you're encouraging me in this moment is the exact same thing the enemy wants. It's for me not to die for the sins of the people. Get behind me, Satan. But did Peter learn his lesson? No, he was all mouth all the time. When Jesus is washing the feet of the disciples, Peter goes self-righteous. Oh, Jesus, hold up. You're not going to wash my dirty, stinky feet. Like, I'm not going to allow myself to have my feet washed by the Son of God. Like, I mean, look how righteous I am. Like, I'm not going to have the Son of God kneel and wash my feet. To which Jesus responds, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me. To which Peter responds, oh, if that's the case, like, throw me in the shower. Like, I'll take a full head-to-toe bath. In that same conversation, Jesus tells his followers, someone's going to betray me. And among this group that's sitting here, one of you will betray me. Guess who speaks up? Peter. Jesus. Everybody may betray you. I mean, look at these clowns. All of them may turn their back on you, but not this guy. Not me. I'll never betray you. Jesus, I'll die before I betray you. Now, these guys, have you seen James? Like, you should hear the things James says behind the scenes. Like, he totally doubts, Jesus, that you're the Son of God. Let's just get it out here in the open. John, you heard it too. Remember what James said behind the rock the other day? Son of God, my foot. Like, these guys might betray you. They might deny you, but not this guy, not me. I'll die first. What did Jesus say? Peter, 3 times before the night's over. Not me, three times. Not just once, Peter, 3 times. That night when they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus pulls his inner circle of disciples out, Peter, James, and John. He's like, the time is now. Guys, I'm about to go through it. I need you to pray for me. Like, the intensity of that moment was overwhelming as Jesus is preparing to die. And we see his humanity as he wrestles with the dying on the cross and praying to the Father, not my will but thine. And it says a lot that the Son of God asks for his inner circle. Would you pray for me in this moment? Like, I need your prayers. And Peter, the not me, I'll die first guy. When Jesus comes back to see how the prayer meeting's going, he finds Peter and his boys sound asleep. Peter, wake up. I need you in this moment. I need you to pray for me. I need your prayer support. I need the strength that comes through prayer. Peter, will you pray for me? Absolutely, Jesus, I'll pray for you. And within a few moments, he's out like 3 times until the point that Jesus just gives up and says, just let him sleep. When he needs prayer, Peter's out like a light. And then, when the crowd shows up to arrest Jesus, Peter's the first one to pull out his sword. I'll show you how ready I am to die for you, Jesus. I'm ready to fight. And I don't know if it was just bad aim or what, but when his attempt to decapitate someone, he just cut off their ear. I'm not sure that's any better than getting your whole head lopped off if you just get your ear cut off. Like, just the ear. That's got to hurt, right? And so in that moment, Peter shows his aggressiveness to defend the Son of God. What does Jesus say? Peter, put your sword away. You missed the point. And he heals the ear that's been sliced off. Peter, it's not about that. You've missed the entire point. Put your knife away, Peter. And then Peter's lowest moment in life. Jesus has been unjustly tried in a kangaroo court, and he's about to be murdered. And Peter lingers in the background in the courtyard to watch all of this unfold, and he's confronted. Aren't you one of Jesus' followers? I've seen you with him. I've heard you talk about him. Your language portrays that you're one of his followers. You're one of those Jesus guys. To which Peter says, no, not me. No, I've seen you with him, Peter. You're the guy. You were there when he healed. You were there when they fed the crowd. No, that's not me, Peter. I've heard the story about when you walked on the water. Though that's not me. Expletives, fill in the blank. I don't even know who he is. By the way, this is not a Roman soldier that's confronting Jesus. This is not a man with a sword that's ready to execute the disciples of Jesus. This is not a big, burly brute that's about to pull Peter aside and take him to court too. Peter's being confronted by a schoolyard slave girl. A 12-year-old girl points her finger in the face of Peter and he says, not me. It's not me. I don't blanking know him. And denies him. Like, I don't think it would go over well with Ashley if someone said to me, you're Ashley's husband, which is a common occurrence. You're Ashley's husband, aren't you? No. Ashley who? I don't know and Ashley. I've seen you with her. You have a child together. Like I've seen you on Facebook together. I've seen the pictures of your vacation and your family events. You're married to Ashley, aren't you? No, I don't even. Ashley who? Who's Ashley? I don't know Ashley. Aren't you the father of Kaylee and Reagan and Zach? Man, aren't they awesome kids? And then you have a new child, Levi. Aren't they your children? Man, I've watched them at school, and I've seen them on the volleyball court or the dance team or the basketball team. Like I've seen your kids. They seem like good kids and intelligent kids and good looking. Aren't they your kids? No, those aren't I don't even know who you're talking about. I don't know a Kaylee, Reagan, and what? What did you say? Zach, who? Levi, what? I don't think it would go over well to deny the people I claim to love the deepest. And there he stands, confronted by a schoolyard girl. And not only does he deny being a follower, he curses and denies even knowing him. That's Peter. When Jesus picks the team and he says, I'll take him. I'll take the denier. I'll take the denier 3 times. But Jesus, he wouldn't give up on Peter, would he? Luke 22. This is before Peter's going to deny. Luke 22:31. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he may sift you like wheat. Jesus says, Simon, you're an influence, like Satan wants you and he's going to abuse you. But what does Jesus say? Jesus says, Peter, I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. When you've been sifted like wheat, when you've denied and you've betrayed, I prayed for your faith. I prayed that you would remain faithful. Jesus prayed for Peter's faith. I prayed for you, Peter, the Son of God, who knew what Peter would do, who selected Peter to be on his team, who chose him for his kickball team, who chose him to be one of his followers when he would deny him and betray him, and when he would be overzealous, and when he would be cocky, and everything about Peter that made Peter Peter. Jesus selected him and said, you're one of my followers, and you're going to fail me, but guess what? I'm praying for your faith. I'm praying because at one point, Peter, you're going to get it and you're going to change the world because of the gospel. And I'm praying for you. And I choose you when other people wouldn't choose you. You're on my team. And then we don't have time to get into it, but the restoration of Peter when Jesus comes to him after he's denied him. And he enables him and he equips him. And the Peter that we see in the book of Acts is a different Peter as he stands and he preaches at Pentecost. And do not forget in this story that we are Peter. We're Peter. I won't deny you, Jesus, unless the situation calls for it. I'll pretend I know you, Jesus, unless the situation demands otherwise. Unless I'm around these friends, this group, and I need to blend in, then we are Peter. We point our finger, we blame God, we overreact, we pull Jesus to the side and say, Jesus, what are you doing? We are Peter, and yet he chooses us, and he prays for our faith, and he prays for our faithfulness. Here's the point of grace. If you think your Bible reading plan and your prayer life and your moralistic New Year's resolutions are what makes Jesus love you and redeem you, you don't get grace. Grace is what makes God love you. It's not our moral behavior, or I read my Bible today, God must be pleased with me. We are Peter. I love some of these other characters, James and John. James and John were blue collar. They were hard workers. I think James or John is the cigar smoker in the portrait. I think they drink cheap beer. I think they're Coors Light guys. They're successful in their hard labor jobs. They're the guys that work the boats. I've had the opportunity through my work to go into Maine, which is part of my territory. And we have a customer there that his brother owns a lobster harvesting company where they go out on these boats and bring in these big cages of lobsters. And so I've had the opportunity to go out and watch that happen. And the guys that work that job are men. They're men's men. And their hands are calloused and cut. And they're tough. And they go through 10 packs of cigarettes in an hour. They're tough guys. And their language is coarse. And they're going to die by the time they're like 31 because of all they do and go through. But I'll never forget the first time I went and watched these guys pull these cages in just time after time after time, and it doesn't stop, and it's wet and it's cold, and the waters are often icy up there. And he looked at me and said, "Devin, tell your kids to get an education, or this is what they're going to be doing with their life." That's James and John. They're the lobster harvesting boat guys. Now, their business was successful. We learn in Mark's gospel that they had successful businesses because they had people that worked for them. But they were physically tough. They were mentally tough. They are the NRA boys. They're the blue-collar, hard-working guys with the calluses on their hands. Look what Mark says in chapter 3, verse 17 about James and John. So I love their title. As a matter of fact, my older brother and I actually were called this on occasion as preacher kids growing up that didn't always behave like we should. 3:17, James the son of Zebedee and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. The sons of thunder. And it wasn't because of their impressive bodily function skills that they were called the sons of thunder. It's because they were hard-working people with a quick temper. They had violent tendencies. One of my favorite stories of James and John is in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. Check these guys out. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. A little bit of context. Jews hated Samaritans. They were mortal enemies, despised each other. Jews considered the Samaritans half-breeds. If you trace their history, you would understand why. Jews often, when they were traveling between Jerusalem and some of the lower parts of the countryside, they would bypass Samaria. So when we get into John chapter 4, you'll see the significance of Jesus passing through the land of Samaria to meet a woman at a well. In this case, they're making preps as they enter into this village of Samaritans, verse 53, but the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us," look how they phrase this, "do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. I love this story. The Samaritans do not receive him. Now we read in the text, it wasn't a Samaritans thing, it was a God thing. He was headed toward Jerusalem. And James and John's response is, do what? They don't want to receive you? They don't want to receive you? Jesus, do you want us to nuke them? Do you want us to call down fire from heaven? Who are you? You're fishermen. How are you going to call down fire from heaven? Almost, don't you picture them as some kind of racist, Jersey boys? That's why I think they're like the cigar guys. I can almost hear their accent. Jesus, you want us to call out the big guns? We're going to call down fire from heaven. Do you want us to call down fire from heaven? That's James and John. With their tempers. Their hard-working, blue-collar attitude in life. And Jesus says, I'll take them. They're on my team. How about Simon the Zealot? Let me tell you about Simon the Zealot. The Zealots of that day were political revolutionaries. They had violent aggression toward Rome. The whole reason that Simon probably was willing to follow Jesus is because he thought Jesus was going to overthrow the Romans and set up an earthly kingdom. They were going to kick Roman butt. They were literally the organized religious militia of their day. Like if Simon was alive today, he's holed up in a compound in Montana with a bunch of guns. That's Simon, the zealot. Jesus, we're going to overthrow the Romans. We're going to set up an earthly kingdom. And Jesus says, that guy's on my team. And here's what I'm going to teach you, Simon. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. What? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. I know you're zealous. I know that you're a political revolutionary, but you're going to become a part of a different kingdom. It's not about guns and violence. It's about loving your enemies, praying for those that persecute you. How about Matthew? We've talked about Matthew before. His surname is Levi. Levi is the priestly tribe from where the priests came. And Matthew may be the worst one of all. He was a tax collector, a traitor. He betrayed his own people to work for the enemy. The equivalent of Matthew would be if a blue-blooded American joined forces with the Taliban to fight Americans. That's Matthew. He sold out to the enemy. Like, can you imagine you grew up with Matthew, you play in the streets together, you play ball together? When Matthew grows up, he joins the enemy. Not only does he join the enemy, but he flaunts it in your face as you work hard under the cruel thumb of the Roman Empire, and most of your money goes to make them successful, and you're trying to put bread on the table, you're trying to put food on the table for your kids, you're trying to provide, you're working hard, you're keeping your nose to the grindstone, you're trying to keep out of the way of the Roman soldiers, you're trying to remain anonymous, you're trying to keep quiet, and Matthew comes into your neighborhood with the brute force of the Roman soldiers and knocks on your door and says, I know we grew up as childhood friends, I know we played in the streets together, but now I work for the Romans. And he takes the bread off your table, and he takes the money out of your pocket, and he flaunts it in your face, and he lives in the nicest house in the neighborhood. Matthew was a visible representation of everything the Jews hated. That's Matthew. He worked for the opposite team. As a matter of fact, the religious Jews said tax collectors are beyond the reach of grace. They can't be made righteous. That's Matthew. Guess where Jesus stops? In the streets of Jerusalem. He stops at Matthew's toll booth. Luke 5:27. After this, he went out and he saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And then I love this part of the story. And Levi made him a great feast in his house. And there was a large company, a large crowd of tax collectors and others reclining at the table with them. And the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious elite, they grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why does Jesus eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." What we've learned about Charis, what we've learned about grace displayed in the life of Jesus, personified by Jesus, is that God sniffs out the pimp. God sniffs out the traitor. God pursues the unrighteous. And he says to Matthew, "Follow me." And when Matthew follows, Jesus says, let's call a party and celebrate. Invite your family and friends. Invite the people you hang out with. Invite the other tax collectors and the notorious sinners. And we're going to sit and we're going to hang out and we're going to talk. Here's what Jesus doesn't say to Matthew. Matthew, now that you're following me, let's go hang out at the temple. I'm going to make you one of the religious elite. What he says to Matthew is your mission field starts at your house. It starts with those people that you know. Invite your boys. And the religious elite look on and they say, look at the company that Jesus keeps. And Jesus says, you're exactly right. That's who I came for. Sinners in need of grace. When I call Dr. Beach during the week, it's usually not for he and I to just hang out. Maybe I should, to just hang out sometimes. But most of the time when I call him, you know why? He says, I got a kid that's under the weather or sick. Or, hey, Dr. Beach, can I bring Reagan by? Can I bring Zach by? Kaylee's dealing with this. What do you suggest? Because he's our doctor. When we have sick kids, I call my doctor because they need a doctor. Jesus says, I came for sick people. The implication of this text is, guess who the sick people are? It's all of us. That we are spiritually sick. We are Peter. We are spiritually sick. And Jesus came for us. It's all about grace. We don't have time to talk about all these. There's Andrew, who is just the quiet shadow dweller. There's Philip, who's the constant question asker. There's Thomas, that we call Doubting Thomas because he was a certain level of skeptic. There's Judas Iscariot, who would actually betray Jesus. And yet when we read the story of Jesus kneeling down and washing the feet of his disciples, guess who's there? Judas Iscariot. Jesus washes the feet of the betrayer. This is the company Jesus kept. This is the ones he chose to follow him. These are the people God selected to advance his kingdom. There's no plan B. It's grace. 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 Let me mention just one more, and we'll be done. I love her story. Luke chapter 8, 1 and 2. Soon afterward, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news, the gospel of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. I love the story of Mary Magdalene. The Bible says he had cast 7 demons out of her. The number 7 is the number of completion in the Bible. So either they were literal demons that he called out of her, like exorcists like delivered her from demons, or at a minimum, Mary Magdalene had some severe mental health issues that controlled her life. That all of her life, 7 demons, the number of completion, that all of her life was controlled by these demonic forces within her. Either actual demons that resided in her physical body, or the demons of life that plagued her and darkened her soul. She had severe mental health issues. You know who Mary Magdalene is? Mary Magdalene is the crazy bag lady with the shopping cart when you go to the big city, that's pushing the shopping cart around and is muttering things that you can't understand. And she's muttering to herself, and she has all these weird things in her basket, and she lives in the gutter, and she's been rejected by society. And when you walk by her, you hold your kids a little closer. And she has lots of baggage in life. That's Mary Magdalene, the crazy bag lady. And then she meets Jesus. And she can't get enough of him. And she's committed to him. You know how committed? She's more committed than the disciples. Judas betrays Jesus. Peter denies Jesus. All the disciples but one run away from Jesus in his most crucial moment. But not Mary. Mary can't leave Jesus. I mean, where else is she going to go? And so she's always there. At the cross. She's there. at the tomb to anoint Jesus' body after 3 days. Mary's there. When Jesus appears for the first time, guess who's there? It's Mary. Mary Magdalene. It's Mary that Jesus says, go and tell the disciples that I'm alive. She's there, she's there, she's there. She can't get enough of Jesus. Why? Because when she was a homeless reject, controlled by the dark forces of her soul, carrying around a lifetime of baggage, Jesus set his affection on her. He loved her and restored her and redeemed her. And she can't get enough of it. See, that's grace. And I'm afraid that many of us are willing, we're willing to put up with misfits and rejects. Listen to me. We're willing to put up with them. We serve them meals. We hand them money on occasion. But that isn't grace. That isn't Charis. That's tolerance. There's no pursuit. There's no aggression. There's no stubborn delight. There's no relentless hunt for sinners. And yet, God aggressively seeks out, values, and if we're being honest, uses thugs to build His kingdom. That's a term we use a lot, right? Bunch of thugs. We don't mean it in a complimentary way. And yet Jesus sought thugs to build His kingdom. Grace is more than a buzzword. It's more than a prayer before a meal. It's more than a name we throw in our churches. It's more than the words of a song or the subject of a cliche. It is more than being tolerant. It's more than being nice. It's more than being lenient. Grace. Can't control it. Can't clean it up. Can't domesticate it. Can't completely understand it. And yet, it's what flows through the veins of Jesus. It's what makes His heart beat. It's what we saw last week is etched on the palms of His hands. Grace is what makes His heart beat for us. Spiritual misfits, rebels. It's what caused Jesus to do everything necessary to enter into our brokenness and bring us back to God. Follow me, Jesus says. Follow me on this road, on this journey of grace and redemption and forgiveness and hope and eternal life. Not based on what you've done, not based on what you do, but based on who Jesus is, based on who God is, that He is the God of Charis, that He is the God of grace, that He invites rebels to follow. We are the thugs. We are the misfits. We are the rebels. We are the obnoxious. We are the stubborn. We are the self-consumed. We are the self-righteous. We are the doubtful. We are the violent. We are the angry. We are the abrasive. We are the abusive. We are the timid. We're the betrayers, and we're the doubters, and we're the skeptics, and we're the sinners, and we are the deniers. We are who God chose. We are who He selected. We are who He invited to come and follow Him, because we are the ones in need of constant grace. We are the ones who rest in grace and rest in who He is. We are the ones who pledge our allegiance to the one who is faithful to us even when we are not faithful to Him. The invitation's simple, isn't it? Follow me. Follow me. Here's the irony of all this. I'm afraid sometimes that we are reluctant to follow because we believe it's going to take us on a path of righteousness that we can't manage. I'm afraid that we're afraid to follow because we're afraid we can't live up to the expectations. We're not good enough. We're afraid to follow because we're afraid we'll not be righteous enough, holy enough, obedient enough. You know the irony of that? The irony of that is this. When Jesus says, follow me, when He says, follow me, the path upon which we follow takes us into the exact opposite of that, doesn't it? It takes us into the places of unrighteousness and sinfulness and rebellion and brokenness. That's the journey that we follow Jesus on as He redeems our souls, is into the journey of the sick, is what He says. I didn't come to call the righteous. When you follow me, it's going to take you on a path where you're uncomfortable. Not because you don't measure up, but because of the people that Jesus is pursuing. But when we get grace, when we understand grace, we realize that grace is a way of life. As we live everyday life amidst the brokenness, that our call is to constantly be redeemed by Jesus and to point people in the brokenness toward redemption. Because there is one who is faithful when we are not.